Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 6th of September 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today on video link is Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches and Vanessa Bailey, Associate Editor with 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, both of you. We're just going to get straight on into this. Quite a bit to get through today. And we're going to begin with the European Court of Justice ruling on asylum seekers and migrants. Because they have decided that Hungary and Slovakia, who had appealed over the previous ruling over this issue, over whether they were going to be forced to take a certain level of migrants, they have lost that case. The European Court of Justice has decided that the European Union can absolutely impose requirements on countries to take particular numbers of migrants. Various mainstream media covering this. This is the European Parliament President Tajani's tweet today saying today's ECJ ruling on relocation of asylum seekers is clear. Every EU state must honour their commitments and respect the rule of law. Well, that garnered this response from one person. This is typical, which said every state in the EU must now take their fair share of terrorists and rapists from Africa. This is the law. But of course, Alex and Vanessa, there is something to be said for this statement to a certain degree, but this is only part of the picture because, as we were mentioning last week, of course, the latest business is migration. It is human trafficking. And we made the point that based on the recent National Crime Agency statistics in the UK, that the sex trade was the largest contributor to this drive for human trafficking. And we also made the point, of course, that it's not just the sex trade, but it's particularly the child sex trade, because the figures in red there, or the graph in red, shows how much of the human trafficking in the UK, at least, is amongst people that are under 17 years of age. And so last week we were making the point that, in fact, Department for International Development has got to take some responsibility for this because it is DFID money which is going into these countries that are where the migrants are coming from, and so on. And then yesterday, if you saw the programme, we were talking about HSBC shutting down small businesses in the UK as a result of money laundering. And just by coincidence, today Europol has published a report from suspicion to action, converting financial intelligence into greater operational impact. And they are looking at money laundering and really the main drivers for money laundering. And they pushed out this little infographic. And, you know, when we were talking about human trafficking last week, we were making the point that the business model is quite similar to that of the drugs trade. And what Europol is saying here is that if they look at the cases of money laundering that they're investigating, 15% of those cases are as a result of drugs trafficking. At this point in time, only 2% of the cases that they're looking at is money laundering as a result of trafficking in human beings. But this, I suspect, is going to increase as time goes on. So, you know, we've got Syria, Alex, we've got all the conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, and so on, driving this. And of course, we know very well that migration, human trafficking is part of the issue here. The other part is just simply the destruction of the homogeneity of nation states being driven by internationalists. So, you know, we seem to have a huge, big mire of pretty disgusting behaviour going on.
I think what's most striking about it at this stage, Mike, is the small number of those involved. They do appear to emanate from the same institutions, mindsets, coteries. They seem to share the same banks, be in positions, in some cases in financial institutions. And as we're seeing with reporting such as that of Dilyana Gaitandzhieva, who of course has now been fired by Trud newspaper for her pains, we're finding that the routes used, this has been done by other airlines before, Silkway of Azerbaijan, by the way, are two-way or three-way journeys, just like there was this nefarious three-cornered Atlantic trade in the early modern era between Britain, West Africa, and the Caribbean, with a different commodity, human beings or other, being put in at each stage. So the same thing is happening now with the airlines, that the drugs are coming one way, or the diamonds, and the people are coming the other with the arms. So it's a complete business model, I think. And people often say in the investigation of organized crime, where should we start, with the drugs or the terrorism or the sex? But it's all of the same piece, really.
Vanessa, we're hearing good news out of Syria at the moment, which we're going to come on to in a second. But over the last number of years, obviously Syria has been a major source of people in the migration trade, and particularly in the human trafficking trade. Do you think that as the situation improves, or how much do you think as the situation improves, those people are going to want to return home? Or has this business model established a firm foothold?
No, I think in Syria, actually, of the overall refugee figures, I think Syria only represented a relatively small amount, 20%, less than 20%. And what we're seeing recently, even from UN organizations, are figures in upwards of 600,000 that are returning to Syria. Of course, negating the propaganda that these refugees are fleeing the Syrian government and the Syrian army. And over half of those, I think, in the last 6 months of 2016, were actually returning to Aleppo as it was being liberated. So while I think Syria has certainly been a part of, let's say, the harvesting program, the unity and the strength of the Syrian resistance has assured that many of those refugees that have left Syria are now coming back safely. But that doesn't deny the fact that I'm quite sure there is a degree of trafficking, particularly of child trafficking and organ trafficking, from Syria, without a doubt.
Okay, well, let's move on to Deir ez-Zor then, because the headlines from RT, strangely, the Western press, they now are at least talking about it, but they're not being quite as positive as perhaps Russia Today is. Syrian soldiers embrace after breaking 3-year ISIS siege of Deir ez-Zor. And the other article here, tunnels, guns and abandoned tanks, secrets of ISIS stronghold revealed in Deir ez-Zor. And this article here saying that Syrian forces have captured the fortified area near Deir ez-Zor, which was struck by Russian cruise missiles, which Moscow says killed over 200 jihadists. Troves of weapons, explosives and damaged armoured vehicles were found on the site where the terrorists had holed up. Now, one of the things that I found particularly interesting about this article, Vanessa, was that it says that that when they were looking at the people that were actually holed up, and as they describe it in that area, there was evidence. They were suggesting that that many of these people had come from Russia and from former Soviet republics. So I thought that was an interesting statement, and I was just wondering if you could clarify where these people were actually, who these people are, and where they'd actually come from.
Yeah, I mean, that was a very interesting, quite ambiguous statement, as it didn't sort of clarify it, and perhaps Alex can also expand on this. But I would guess that many of them obviously have come from Chechnya, and that has been one of the main drivers for Russia's involvement in the destruction of ISIS and the jihadist forces in Syria, is because of this very real threat of these terrorist and extremist elements returning to Russia, very much as China with the Uyghurs, obviously forces that are also inside Syria. So there is a very clear understanding of Russia's involvement, not only for its various commitments to Syria as a defense ally, but also to defend its own territorial integrity in the future. What is interesting is that, yes, Russia deployed a naval cruise missile. It hit this stronghold of ISIS. Now, what nobody seems to be raising questions about is, which actually I raised on RT a couple of months ago, why were the US so intensively bombing this area, the US coalition? It's now becoming very clear because yet again they were trying to cover up the evidence that somebody has been supplying these arms and equipment and vehicles to ISIS marooned in the center of Syria. I mean, this was the ISIS hub in Syria. From here, they could radiate out to basically north, south, east, west. But this was the hub. It was in central Syria. So how was all of this incredible array of equipment received by ISIS in the middle of Syria, if not with help from the US coalition? And does that explain why the US coalition has been so intensively bombing this area? And of course, Raqqa. And I think once Raqqa is liberated, which will be the next step, we will see exactly the same configuration of tunnels, equipment, and ammunition, weaponry, etc. It's disgusting. It's actually, I mean, you know, what Syria has done here, and we mustn't underestimate the symbolic victory. Aleppo was already a symbolic victory. It exposed the mainstream media for what it was, a bunch of charlatans basically working in lockstep with the various regimes that were trying to destabilize Syria. With the liberation of Deir ez-Zor, or the breaking of the back of the ISIS siege, the Syrian army now has full control of Syria. And from here, basically, we're going to watch the final driving out of the international terrorism inside Syria, including, I hope, the United States bases that are clinging to the raft of ISIS and their various jihadist allies inside Syria.
Well, just before I do ask Alex for comment on this, one other thing that I wanted to ask you, Vanessa, was that you know, if we look at how this war has progressed over the last couple of years, it seems that, to me at least, that as any time that ISIS has taken a major hit, they have moved away from a particular area, and we've seen new fronts opening up somewhere else. This isn't happening this time. Yeah. This time they're either leaving the country or they're being killed. So how much of this do you think is because the West has apparently withdrawn support?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting you should say that, because suddenly there are little rumours that the EU is pushing to partially lift sanctions on Syria. Now, to me, this is a clear indication that the EU at least is seeing that they have lost this regime change campaign. And now what they're trying to do, of course, is to infiltrate via other ways, via civil society, via first sector companies, through rebuilding, reconstruction projects. They're trying to just get that foothold into the financial gains that will come out of the rebuilding of Syria. And so this to me is a very clear signal that the EU at least perceives that they have lost this intervention in Syria, that Syria has resisted against regime change and against destabilization.
So Alex, you know, here's another article. Syrian army liberates 2 towns in central Syria. This is an unstoppable, it seems an unstoppable direction at this point. What are your thoughts on what's and how quickly the situation seems to have turned around?
Well, as Vanessa says, there have been these enclaves ever shrinking in the centre, which is sort of semi-arid, semi-desert of Syria. And it was just the far east and pockets of the southeast which were still largely in control of Daesh. But they do seem to have lost territory quickly. That's the nature of desert warfare, of course. If you don't have the sympathy of the population with you, you can appear to have a great deal of territory, but there's only a few watering holes and civilizational retreat. So if you lose 1 or 2 of them, you've suddenly your true situation becomes apparent. You weren't really holding the territory. This is something which Peter Ford in his part 2 addresses. When we're able to, we're going to issue a second part of that as an Insight Vox, and he does point out this fact that the northern strip of eastern Syria is Kurdish, and they are not going to venture into, certainly not going to hold on behalf of anyone else, the desert territory. It's up to the local Sunni Arabs of the east of Syria to do that, but you can see from the jubilation that they're prepared to do so. Just quickly on Vanessa's point, or yours, Mike, of where in Russia these Russians or Muslims from Russia have come. Well, in Vanessa's own reporting and in others, we have heard people use the Arabic term Shishani, literally meaning Chechen, to describe them, but in Arabic usage, and we've seen this going back for 15 years, that if someone has a kunya, a nom de guerre, a war name of Shishani, that really only means North Caucasian. So it can be anyone from Karachaevo, Cherkessia, Kabardino-Balkaria, right through to Dagestan, which is above Azerbaijan. And what I think is going on is that the Turkic peoples of Dagestan in particular, that's the northeast Caucasus, have been held in reserve for this. In particular, there's a tribe called the Nogai, who are never reported on, who are basically ethnically identical with the Tatars in the underbelly of Russia. Now, of course, we've seen Tatar radicalization within Russia as a result, I would say, of the failure of the game plan in Syria that the West's deep state had. So we've had in towns just outside Tatarstan itself, we've had these knife attacks similar to what we've seen in Western Europe for a while, both of which have been inspired by the Dabik magazine tactics, go for women and children, go for scare tactics. So this is all of a piece now, I think, and what we can expect to see is that the radicalized elements, trained elements from the North Caucasus and Tatarstan, so that's the Islamic parts of Russia, and the Uyghurs in China, are going to be going back there. The Fergana Valley Muslims of Uzbekistan, they're going to be destabilizing those countries now, exporting the Syria model further east because it's failed in Syria.
Okay, have you any brief thoughts on that, Vanessa?
Thank you for that, Alex. Very, very illuminating. I just wanted to make the other point as well. Ken Roth put out a tweet this morning saying sort of rather sour grapes, admitting that the Syrian Arab Army had liberated the siege of Deir ez-Zor, but stating that the rest of Syria was still under siege. Now, ignoring the fact that actually thousands of tons of food, a 40-truck convoy, went from Homs to Deir ez-Zor today to take supplies into the civilians that have basically been under siege from U.S. coalition affiliates for 3 years under ISIS. But prior to that, of course, Deir ez-Zor was taken over by various other jihadist elements before ISIS took control. And so, clearly it's another example. We saw in Aleppo when the siege was broken exactly what happened. People reunited and supplies started coming in. And we found out, obviously, that the terrorist factions had been stockpiling food, medicines, and depriving the civilians of that food and medicine. In Deir ez-Zor, of course, the food has been taken in via very precarious airdrops. But now that we see that the siege, the ISIS siege, the terrorist siege is lifted, the food trucks are suddenly rolling in. So this completely negates the Western media and NATO-aligned NGO propaganda that it is the Syrian government that is besieging and starving its own civilians.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Now let's move on to our favourite NGO, the White Helmets. They are receiving or have received their Tipperary Peace Prize today. I understand there's been some protest to this, Vanessa. We haven't, unfortunately, been able to get images and video in time for today's programme, but that has now arrived, I believe.
Yeah, bless them. The anti-imperialist group in Ireland were present. They just sent the images and the video just as I came online, so I couldn't send them to you this morning, but we can have a look at them tomorrow. But yes, they were outside the Ballykistine Hotel protesting. I have to say, all of these articles that have come out, if you read the comment section, it's extraordinary. I don't think there is one comment that is praising this award for the White Helmets. The majority of them are, protesting the fact that one, Al-Qaeda has been allowed into Ireland, and secondly, that it's just receiving this farce of a peace prize. The incredible interview between Martin Quinn and Audrey Carville of RTE yesterday, or I think it was previously in August. Martin Quinn did not answer one question. He simply displayed the fact, or demonstrated the fact, that he is reading from the UK Foreign Office script and obeying British imperialist diktats. I mean, when you ask somebody, she asked him, the White Helmets have claimed to have saved 100,000 civilians. And he said, well, yes, this is true because it comes from the White Helmets. I mean, this is an extraordinary display of script reading from Martin Quinn. We know that the Tipperary Peace Prize has previously been given to John Kerry, so that gives us some indication of who is funding and who is pulling the strings of this organisation.
Alex, what are your thoughts on this?
I think, Mike, you have to see it in the context of Ireland being ahead of Britain and in some ways the leading English-speaking country in terms of alternative media awareness, because they've been hammered so hard by the European Central Bank, the repossessions. It was a lot of people were actually woken up, to use the standard phrase, by watching Irish videos of common law defiance of house repossessions and the stopping of auctions in Dublin, which were coming out online in 2010, 2011, when England was still asleep, and to some extent even Canada and America were. And so the Irish have got a very keen awareness now, the Republic of Ireland, this is in particular, of the nature of what we're up against with the British deep state. The British deep state, of course, has very long tentacles in the Irish Republic. We've seen G2, the Irish Domestic Security Service, in cooperation with the very discredited Gardaí, the Irish National Police, telling us that there was an Al-Qaeda cell in Waterford in the southeast of Ireland recently. Dublin seems to be getting a new one of these scandals every week, at the same time as the police and the banks in Ireland are deeper and deeper in the doo-doo. So I don't see this as being chance. I see this as a last gasp of the pro-British or Anglo-Irish ascendancy in Dublin to gain the upper hand in the narrative in Ireland, but I think it's too late.
Well, yeah, indeed. And the question then, Vanessa, is is the other purpose that gets served here? Is this like a consolation prize for not getting the Nobel Peace Prize?
Well, I mean, they've been given so many awards by the various, by the Atlantic Council. They were given the Right Livelihood Award. They were given an Oscar, Mike. How can you top that, for heaven's sake? In PR terms. No, I mean, I think this is a desperate attempt by the regime change drivers, and we know that the UK is one of the main drivers, primary drivers, both of the White Helmets, but equally of regime change and destabilization in Syria. I think it's a desperate look. If they let go of the White Helmet myth, then they let go of their entire credibility, both now and in the future, let's face it. Yeah. Because the White Helmets have maintained this war faithfully inside Syria since their creation in 2013. The evidence is mounting. I mean, the fact that Martin Quinn actually said that we're all conspiracy theorists, we're all Russian propagandists, and yet he completely ignored the fact that actually the majority of the evidence comes from the White Helmets themselves, from their own channels, from their own statements, from their own rebel-run media channels. So very little of it actually comes from, let's say, Russia. All that Russia does, or all that we do, is to actually point out the fact that the White Helmets are producing videos showing themselves involved in executions, in the dismemberment of Syrian Arab Army prisoners of war, in the beating of Al-Qaeda prisoners, and so on. So, all he actually did on that RTE interview was to show his allegiance to the British imperialist construct, and also to just demonstrate his own idiocy, frankly.
Yes. Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much. You're welcome to stay on. We're going to move on now to North Korea. Boris was giving a statement we're just going to deal with this briefly, in Parliament yesterday. He said North Korea's brazen defiance has brought universal condemnation. When the UN Security Council met in emergency session yesterday, every member, including China and Russia, denounced the latest nuclear test. He said, "We should not be diverted by arguments that equate the illegal and aggressive actions of Pyongyang with the legitimate and defensive military exercises of South Korea and the United States." We'll come on to that in a second. And he also said that China, and maybe this gives us a clue as to what's going on here. He also said that China, which accounts for 90% of North Korea's overseas trade, has a unique ability to influence the regime. I call on China to use all of its leverage to ensure a peaceful settlement in this grave crisis. And then as the news progressed, it was announced that South Korea would be installing 4 more THAAD missile defense launchers. Possibly. They have announced they're going to install these. They said the decision to complete the deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense and allow the construction of additional facilities at its base in Seongju on Monday is paving the way for the system to become fully operational against the North's escalating nuclear and missile threats. But let's just contrast that with the efforts of Russia and Putin in particular. So he met yesterday on the fringes of the Eastern Economic Forum with the South Korean president, and he basically said we must not drive North Korea into a corner. He said, as I understand it, he said he said Russia does not recognize North Korea's nuclear status. He said that Pyongyang's missile and nuclear program is a flagrant violation of the UN Security Council resolution. It undermines the non-proliferation regime and poses a threat to security in Northeast Asia. This is the reason why Russia supported the statement made by the President of the UN Security Council to condemn the latest ballistic missile launches at the emergency meeting on September the 4th. We also condemned the nuclear test explosion. At the same time, it's obvious that the Korean problems cannot be settled with sanctions and pressure alone. We must not yield to emotions or try to drive North Korea into a corner. I would like to say that Russia is still willing to implement trilateral projects with the participation of North Korea. We could deliver Russian pipeline gas to Korea and integrate the power lines and railway systems of Russia, the Republic of Korea, and North Korea. The implementation of these initiatives will not be only economically beneficial, but will also help to build up trust and stability on the Korean Peninsula. And Alex, this, as I was saying over the last couple of days, is to me the most interesting aspect of this, because while we in the West are wanting to tear everything down, Russia and China and the BRICS, following their conference, are basically saying, no, let's start building stuff up as a means to some kind of peaceful resolution to this.
Well, that's the story of the year, if not the decade, Mike, and it's credit largely to you for having given publicity to this on UK Column as one of the first British channels to pay attention to the One Belt, One Road initiative and its predecessors. All of these come out of a stable of thinking that Eurasia needs to take its destiny into its own hands, in the thinking of Sir Halford Mackinder, the wicked old British geostrategist. Eurasia was the heartland, and the Anglo-Saxon and Allied marine and maritime forces were called Rimland, and the idea was by controlling the coasts right around Eurasia, we will control the whole territory within. And the Chinese, together with Russians, but it's largely a Chinese initiative, have said, well, actually, if we're sufficiently productive, we can control our own destiny and even perhaps have the whip hand over these littoral states on the edge of Eurasia. So that's where this is coming from. And as for Russia's angle, which is somewhat different, yes, it's a marriage of convenience for the time being with the Chinese plans. In the particular case of Korea, they don't have the attitude of the Chinese of using North Korea as a proxy state or a buffer zone, which is very clearly what the Chinese military deep state is doing. But they do have the worry of being a neighboring state. Russia actually has a border with the DPRK, North Korea, a small one if you look around Vladivostok, Primorsky Krai, the far east of Russia. They have this ill-defendable gravelly riverbed border. And of course, being sticklers for international law, the Russians know that in the event of hot fighting, they're going to be obliged to take millions of barefoot refugees over that border, and they've got nothing economic to do with them there. So it's in Russia's paramount interest to prevent war in that region. I don't think I could say the same of Japan or perhaps even China, but certainly Russia is wanting to play it cool.
Yeah. Okay. Let's look at more Tajik. I can't even say, can't even pronounce it, Alex. Tajikistan. This is Al Monitor here. Saudi Arabia woos Persian-speaking Sunnis in Central Asia. What's behind this?
What's going on is, if you think of the 5 stands of Central Asia, the 5 former Soviet ones, so we're not counting Afghanistan, but it sits just above Afghanistan, you've got this mountainous and very poor Republic of Tajikistan, which, unlike the other 4, is not Turkish speaking or Turkic language speaking. They're actually speakers of a Persian language. The Tajiks, they're very dependent on migrant labor to Moscow. Now the Tajiks, because they speak a Persian language mutually intelligible with Farsi, the language of Iran, have looked towards Iran as their big brother to build up their infrastructure for a very long time, while the other 4 have looked to Turkey. But what we see here is that David Scott always says, follow the money and follow the ideology. Sometimes these have a hierarchy. And what we can see in this case is that ethnic ties are above religious affiliation, because the Tajiks are no longer with their ethnic brothers, as it were, in Iran, but everything is trumped by money. Saudi Arabia has come along with shed loads of money and no questions asked, whereas the Tajiks were having to repay debts to the Iranians and not getting around to it. So all this talk of Iran being able to have a belt of countries around the Middle East, which are either Shia or Persian speaking, attached to it, is quite a lot of alarmist talk, because it's a region of the world, much like anywhere else in the world, where money talks. Saudi Arabia, of course, is the proxy for the Western and Israeli deep state in that part of the world. So Tajikistan is basically reneging on its debts, and it sits very strategically on China's western border, as well as having a lot of people illegally working in Russia. So very easy to destabilize both those countries using the Tajiks. So a new chapter of the Great Game up there in the Pamirs is opening. In a way, we're back to the 1880s.
Yes, but an old chapter of the Great Game continues as the Foreign Office and the BBC continue their shenanigans. And you sent me this tweet in Russian, and there's a cartoon attached to it with two guys. One guy sitting on a loo, and the translation that you've given me here is saying they're telling us we need to put gay pride on an equal footing with Victory Day. And the BBC took a grant from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to reframe broadcasting in Russia. And on the toilet cistern, it says BBC Russian service. And on the pipe out of the back of the toilet, it says, for the population of Russia. That's
pretty eloquent, isn't
yes.
it? And if you look at the two gentlemen in their spiffing top hats, the one on the left has got the royal crest. That's the FCO feeding money on a plate to the greedy BBC Russian service, which, like BBC World, BBC Monitoring, has said we need to go commercial and we need funding straight from government. Two excuses for not being funded by license fee. And so the Russian service is in particular being taken, the funding has been taken over straight by the FCO. And as this tweeter acknowledges, the reason for that is that someone is desperate in the FCO for the Russians to hear over the radio that the highlight of the Russian calendar is not the 9th of May, which was mentioned in that tweet when they defeated Nazi Germany and saved the world. No, the highlight of the calendar is gay pride, to show what a tolerant, self-referent society living eternally in an introspective present Russia is, because that's the way the West has gone, and it demands everyone else goes the same way with it. So the Russians have seen through that.
Yeah. Okay, and well, quite a number of articles on this particular slide, but really what you're highlighting here is that right across the mainstream media, we're seeing evidence of the breakup of the European Union.
Yes, the rivalries of the centuries, which the EU tells us it was there to put paid to, have been resuscitated precisely by the artificial process of creating a superstate. On the left, we've got France and Italy having military tiffs because Macron has turned out to be much more patriotic than people thought he would. Yes, he's a Rothschild man. I don't trust him an inch. Don't think anyone does in the alternative media. But he's shown many signs of being more patriotic and pro-industry than people have given him credit for such a young greenhorn. And so he said that the Saint-Nazaire shipyards are actually going to have French orders placed in them, which has upset Italy, which had a previous deal, which Macron's cut across. In the middle slide, Breitbart News is reporting that Poland, under Prime Minister Beata Szydło, has gone ahead and done what it's spent years thinking of doing under less strong government, and actually done now, which is told the Germans, well, if you have tiffs with us over immigration and whatnot, well, we've got a rather large matter of World War II reparations outstanding with you. And on the right, two Dutch pieces from the De Volkskrant and the De Post Online, both pointing out how the Hungarians are not putting up with any nonsense from Western Europe anymore. They've basically persona non grata the outgoing Dutch ambassador when he told the press in his farewell interview that Viktor Orban was employing terrorist tactics. So the Hungarian Foreign Ministry said, we're not going to deport you, but for the rest of your time here, you're not going to come in the Foreign Ministry. And the one under that was talking about a similar point, Orban saying, can we please have 400 billion euros for having 400 million, I believe it was, for having protected the whole of Europe from migrant invasion, which, of course, is related to the European Court of Justice case you mentioned, because Hungary is the leader of the four Visegrad states which had stood up to the European Union, and in particular the European Commission, on these quotas. So,
since you've mentioned that, Alex, just briefly, just going back to our lead story, what do you think Hungary's response is going to be to this ECJ ruling?
Orban has always implied in his speeches that EU membership is something that he wants to reform and not abandon. But I cannot see what other strategies he would have in this juncture, because he's spent a year or two headbanging almost alone in the beginning against Merkel and her crazy policies and the deep state behind her. And now we've got a club of four because Szydło in Warsaw is as strong as he is. I think the next move might be that the Visegrad Four would actually look for some kind of demoted EU membership. They're already openly saying that the centre of economic gravity has shifted towards Russia and China, and they're much more interested in being tied into that emerging rail and trade infrastructure. And the energy relationship is very important there. So it could be that Orban at some point just slings his hook and says, well, that's it. The eastern border of the EU and all the problems it's created for itself is now going to be down the Oder River between Germany and Poland. That would cause some fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would indeed. OK, well, look, let's come to the UK then at last. I have to say this is an issue that I find particularly disturbing, and that's the issue of policing and mental health and the merging of policing and mental health services, because this seems to be the direction that we're heading in. Yesterday, the Policing and Mental Health Conference 2017 was held, and this was jointly run by the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing. Well, if we look on down the page here, we discover that the principal supporter was Capsticks, which is a national scale law firm. And in the blurb here on screen, it says the experience of those suffering from mental illness who come into contact with the criminal justice system has long been a cause for concern and a target for action. Now, with the Policing and Crime Act 2017 coming into force, the need for support from lawyers who understand your market and look for solutions has never been more important. Capsticks is a national law firm with offices in London, Birmingham, Leeds and Winchester. Over 90% of our work is in the public sector. And what I find interesting here, Alex, is this phrase, lawyers who understand your market, because that seems to be part of what's going on here, is the development of a new market. And I have to ask the question, and you can comment on this in a second, why are we suddenly all becoming mentally ill? We're being told almost on a daily basis now in the mainstream media that our society is becoming mentally ill. We need more mental health support and so on. And if you look at who has been actually supporting this, we've got the Institute for Mental Health, we've got Mind, Slater and Gordon, Solve It. So mental health charities, some lawyers, and some training companies. So the Sarah Newton, the Minister for Crime, had a few things to say. She said that it's not necessary to be an expert in this field to be aware of the very high and increasing demand for mental health services of all types. And again, I ask, what's driving this increasing demand? And she said, as the Prime Minister has repeatedly said, we are clear that the police should not be expected to act in the stead of health professionals. They cannot be expected to do that satisfactorily, and it takes them away from their primary function of tackling crime, nor can it be in the best interests of the people affected who need quick access to professional mental health assistance. So, Alex, there's two things that concern me about this. The first is this apparent creation of a new market, and clearly some people see the money in this. And the other thing is this drive to bring police into the position of first responders in the case of some kind of situation involving somebody that's suffering from mental illness. And to me, that seems like a dangerous move, because the police, A, aren't qualified to deal with these situations, but do we then end up moving on a road towards a situation where basically if the police decide they want to get somebody off the streets, then they, as first responders, would be in a position to perhaps label somebody as being mentally ill?
That latter worry is being voiced more and more, Mike, by independent commentators, and I do think that's a real angle. I don't think we can doubt anymore that certain elements who've infiltrated the police are criminal. The same with law firms who are in bed with councils and police across the country. And I don't think we can doubt anymore that gang stalking is a reality. It seemed very conspiracy theory when it started coming on YouTube, but it seems to have been well enough documented now in ordinary British town centres that you can see there's agreements between bunches of sergeants and constables in town centres to pursue certain politically undesirable people who know where the money trail leads or where the children are, for example, pursue them through the centre, some in civvies, some in uniform, until they break down. And of course, under current legislation, if you're in the street, you can be lifted already. You can't be sectioned, or rather the police can't burst into your home to section you. There's moves to change that. There's several interests coalescing here. Some are motivated by the money of the artificially sewed up market, the monopoly of being large law firms that have got the desirable qualification. You know, we are good with mental health. So that's the capsticks of this world. But there's others who are motivated by the ideology and the usual century-long British interest in psychologizing the population and destabilizing them, declaring them mentally ill is a great place to start, because then you can start abusing psychotherapy on them. I think one of the key words to look out for here is vulnerability. I've been shocked this summer by how many chief inspectors and DCIs, so that's senior officers in each of the county constabularies, have been tweeting about the vulnerability agenda. One in the Met Police in London has even said, if you speak English and you're a white male, able-bodied, then we won't even bother coming out to see you. At least that's the press spin on what he said. Obviously, there's a divide and rule element here to get people annoyed. But behind that, what is this vulnerability agenda? Well, it seems clear enough. Theresa May's husband's got these G4S interests, and he's told her, you will cut the police down. The G4S will take as much of the slack as possible. And Theresa May has, several years ago when she was Home Secretary, she declared war on the police as they currently stood. Plenty of writing about that on the internet. And the tool to use it was that to tie them down to be social workers. So whenever the word vulnerability is used, it has the same effect as welfare in education, which is to prevent the public service from doing what it's meant to be there to do, because it's tied up all the time with vulnerability in the case of the police. So it's a smokescreen, I think.
Absolutely. And I just mentioned that you're mentioning G4S and the police. I think it's the Tom Pride blog. If anybody wants to go and have a look at the Tom Pride blog, is absolutely highlighting this issue of G4S and the police at the moment. So go and have a look at that. And we're just going to end off, Alex, with this one. The Committee on Standards in Parliamentary Life is meeting now because they are extremely concerned about the issue of intimidation of parliamentary candidates in the last general election. So they're now gathering evidence and views as part of a review, and they have issued a call for evidence, and they're going to be querying that evidence with people on the 8th of September this year. So that is going on. In the meantime, the Times reporting that they have had from what they describe as three serious sources, that Theresa May is going to drop her move, the Conservative Party move rather, to change the boundaries. So that was going to see the number of MPs being reduced from 650 to 600. Now, the Times is suggesting that this change in attitude has come about because she doesn't think she can get majority support for the boundary changes from her own MPs. And so she's letting this one gently drop. But it does seem a little bit ironic that at a time when the Select Committee is busy looking at intimidation of parliamentary MPs, parliamentary candidates rather, that Theresa May has decided not to reduce the number of parliamentary candidates after all.
Well, what's at the root of this, as in any Anglo-Saxon country, is the geographical constituencies, which have many strengths because you actually elect a man and you know who he is and he's there for you and he's accountable. But one of the weaknesses, every electoral system has a weakness, is the liability to gerrymandering, which is drawing the boundaries, of course, so that supporters of one party are in a kind of deadlock majority in one area. And I think if you look at the longer term, the Conservative Party felt it had an inbuilt majority in the House of Lords, and it felt that it was content to let Labour have the artificially smaller constituencies in the north of England and the Midlands, which had been population drained and still hadn't been shrunk as a result of, or rather the boundaries expanded to reflect the shrinking of the population in those areas. But since 2010, we've seen this flip, the result of the core of which is, I think, that the deep state realised, well, Labour is a dead horse for the foreseeable future. We don't have enough ethnic minority support to carry it forward, so the Conservatives are going to be the party of deep state rule. And with that in mind, the Conservatives have to make sure that they have a majority in the Commons, with or without Liberal Democrat coalition support.
Yes, so much more likely than the excuse of we don't think we can get this through with at least there may be too many Tory rebels on this occasion.
Yes, Tory rebels, well, who are they these days? I can only really see Jacob Rees-Mogg. There was a clip recently of him debating constitutional issues and rights with Florence of Arabia, of course, as we often call him, the one of the interesting characters. I've forgotten his real name right now, but that's MP from the Lakes District, and that was quite an interesting watch because there were 2 Labour MPs turning out to hear him.
Yes. Okay, look, we're going to end it there. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us. Thank you very much to Vanessa Bailey for her input earlier on the programme. Thank you for joining us, and we will be back at the same time as usual, 1 p.m. tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.